Imagine a lake so clear that in the middle of winter, scientists can drop a small white disk into the water and still see it 70, 80, even 90 feet down. Now imagine that same lake, one of the deepest in North America, slowly shrinking year after year until the shoreline pulls back and reveals things that had been hidden underwater for generations. That is not a legend. That is the real, documented story of Lake Tahoe. And what has actually been found there over the last several years is strange enough on its own. No exaggeration required. Lake Tahoe sits high in the Sierra Nevada, straddling the border between California and Nevada at more than 6,000 feet of elevation. It is the largest alpine lake in North America, and at its deepest point it plunges more than 1,600 feet, making it the second deepest lake in the United States after Oregon's Crater Lake. What sets Tahoe apart from almost every other major lake on the continent is not just its size, but its extraordinary clarity. Because the surrounding granite basin contributes so little sediment and nutrient runoff, and because the water is so cold for most of the year, very little algae or organic matter grows in it. The result is water so transparent that it has become one of the most photographed natural features in the American West, and a lake that scientists have studied obsessively for more than half a century. Precisely because that clarity is fragile and worth protecting. That scientific attention did not start as idle curiosity. It started because people noticed the water was changing, and they wanted to understand why. In 1968, researchers from the University of California, Davis began a monitoring program at Lake Tahoe that continues to this day, now run through the university's Tahoe Environmental Research Center. Between 1968 and 1971, the average clarity depth measured by that research team was around 97 feet. That was the baseline. Over the following decades, as development accelerated around the lake basin, that number began to fall. By the year 2000, average clarity had declined by roughly a third from where it started. That decline was not a matter of speculation or rumor. It was measured, year after year, disc by disc, and published in reports that anyone can read. The reason for that decline traces directly back to the post-war boom that transformed the region. Before World War II, Lake Tahoe was remote and difficult to reach, ringed by a scattering of lodges and cabins that catered to a small number of visitors willing to make a rough journey into the mountains. That changed quickly after the war. Improved roads, a growing highway system, and a new generation of Americans with cars and disposable income turned Tahoe into a booming resort destination through the 1950s and 60s. Casinos opened on the Nevada side, hotels and vacation homes multiplied on both shores, and construction crews reshaped huge stretches of the basin in a remarkably short span of years. All of that development came with a cost that nobody had really planned for. Grading hillsides, paving roads, and building at scale without modern stormwater controls sent enormous amounts of fine sediment, fertilizer runoff, and construction debris into the lake. It was that sediment and nutrient pollution, not buried barrels of industrial poison, that scientists identified as the real driver behind Tahoe's clarity loss. Fine particles suspended in the water scatter light and cloud the view, and once they settle, they feed the kind of algae growth that clouds a lake even further. By the late 1960s, the trend was clear enough and alarming enough that it changed policy. Partly in direct response to the early clarity findings out of UC Davis, California and Nevada came together in 1969 to create the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, a bi-state body with real authority to regulate development around the basin. It was one of the earliest examples in the country of two states cooperating to protect a shared natural resource through binding land use rules, and it set the tone for decades of environmental work that followed. In the years since, government agencies, universities, and nonprofit groups have poured more than $2.5 billion into projects aimed at protecting and restoring the lake's clarity, decommissioning and repaving hundreds of miles of roadway to cut down on runoff, restoring more than 1,000 acres of wetlands that filter sediment before it reaches the water, and building stormwater systems designed to catch fine particles before they ever get near the shoreline. Has it worked? The honest answer, based on the most recent clarity reports, is complicated. Winter clarity, when the lake is calmer and less disturbed, has actually improved substantially in recent years, with some winter readings the clearest recorded since the early 1980s. Summer clarity, on the other hand, has continued to struggle, partly because warmer water temperatures and reduced seasonal mixing, both linked to a changing climate, are working against decades of pollution control efforts. The most recent annual average sits at roughly 70 feet, which is meaningfully better than it might otherwise be, but still well short of that original 97-foot baseline from the late 1960s. Lake Tahoe is not a ruined lake by any stretch, but it is also not the untouched wilderness the postcards sometimes suggest. It is a lake with a real, well-documented industrial and environmental history, one that scientists have been tracking in exhaustive detail for nearly 60 years. Now let's talk about the drought, because this is where the story gets genuinely strange, even without any embellishment. The western United States endured a punishing stretch of dry years through the early 2020s. Snowpack across the Sierra Nevada fell far below normal in several of those years, and Lake Tahoe's water level, which depends heavily on snowmelt feeding into it, dropped along with it. At one point in 2021, the lake actually fell below its natural rim, the elevation at which water stops flowing out through the Truckee River altogether. When a lake that size drops even a few feet, it does not sound dramatic on paper, but at the shoreline, where the water meets the land, a few feet can expose a startling amount of ground that has been submerged for years or decades. Docks that used to float now sit stranded on dry rock. Boat ramps end well short of the water, and along certain stretches of shore, old debris that had been quietly buried under the surface starts to reappear. This is not unique to Tahoe, and that is actually the more interesting part of the story. Across the American West, the same historic drought that lowered Tahoe's waterline was hitting reservoirs and lakes everywhere, and in several of those places, the results made real national news. The most striking example is Lake Mead, the massive reservoir on the Colorado River formed by Hoover Dam, straddling the border of Nevada and Arizona. As Lake Mead's water level fell to its lowest point since the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s, boaters and park rangers began finding things nobody expected. In May of 2022, boaters spotted a corroded metal barrel resting on the newly exposed lakebed near Las Vegas. When park rangers opened it, they found human remains inside. Homicide detectives with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department determined, based on the style of shoes found with the body, that the killing likely happened sometime between the mid-1970s and the early 1980s, and that the victim had been shot. It was, by any measure, a real cold case, decades old, suddenly reopened by a receding shoreline. Just days later, two sisters paddleboarding on the same lake spotted bones in a different part of Lake Mead and alerted rangers, who confirmed those remains were human as well. Over that same drought period, park officials at Lake Mead ended up recovering multiple sets of human remains as the water kept dropping, each case triggering its own investigation into decades-old disappearances. Those are real, reported, verifiable events, covered at the time by the Associated Press, local news stations, and national outlets, with named detectives, dated statements, and ongoing investigations. It is a genuinely unsettling example of how a drought can turn a lake into an accidental crime scene excavation, pulling back a curtain that had been closed for 50 years. But it is important to be precise about where that happened. That was Lake Mead, a reservoir on the Colorado River formed by a dam in the 1930s, sitting in the desert between Nevada and Arizona. It is a completely different body of water from Lake Tahoe, an alpine lake up in the Sierra Nevada, more than 400 miles away, with its own separate history, its own separate drought timeline, and its own separate set of discoveries. At Lake Tahoe itself, the actual documented findings during the recent low-water years have been far less sensational, but still genuinely interesting. As the shoreline receded, hikers and residents reported stretches of exposed lakebed that had not been visible in years, along with the usual scattering of old debris that tends to accumulate near any heavily used shoreline over decades. Old tires, bottles, corroded fragments of docks and equipment, and the occasional vehicle that had been driven onto the ice in some past winter and never recovered when it broke through. None of that is evidence of a coordinated, decades-long conspiracy to dump toxic waste in the deep basin, and no credible scientific survey, university research team, or law enforcement agency has reported discovering fields of leaking industrial barrels or human remains at Tahoe's extreme depths. The deep basin of Lake Tahoe, below about 1,500 feet, is genuinely difficult and expensive to survey. It requires specialized equipment capable of withstanding enormous pressure and near-freezing temperatures, and very few organizations have the funding or the reason to send remotely operated vehicles down there. That absence of exploration is real. What is not real, at least based on any verifiable reporting, is a secret trove of toxic barrels and preserved bodies, waiting to be found the moment someone finally looks. So why do the two lakes get confused so easily in stories that circulate online? Partly because the details rhyme. Both are large western lakes that have experienced serious, well-publicized droughts in the past several years. Both have real histories tangled up with rapid, underregulated development. Tahoe with its post-war tourism and casino boom, Meade with the sprawling growth of Las Vegas that depends on it. And both sit at extreme depths capable of preserving objects and remains for far longer than most people expect, which makes them natural settings for stories that blend a real phenomenon with invented specifics. Cold, low oxygen, high-pressure water genuinely does slow decomposition and corrosion dramatically compared to conditions at the surface, and that scientific fact is often borrowed, accurately, to make a fictional or exaggerated story feel plausible. The responsible way to tell the story, then, is to keep those two threads separate and honest. Lake Tahoe has a real and well-documented environmental history, a post-war development boom that measurably clouded some of the clearest water in North America, a scientific monitoring program that has tracked the decline for nearly 6 decades without interruption, a landmark by state agency created specifically to fight back against it, and a recent, historic drought that dropped its water level low enough to expose shoreline that had not seen daylight in years. Lake Meade, several hundred miles away, has its own real and far more dramatic history. A reservoir built by damming the Colorado River in the 1930s, a modern drought that pushed its water level to record lows, and as a direct result, the recovery of multiple sets of human remains tied to cold case homicides that investigators are still working to fully solve. Both of those stories are true. Both are worth telling carefully, with real sources and real names attached to them, because the truth here is already strange enough without inventing anything on top of it. A drought that shrinks a lake and exposes a 50-year-old murder case is a genuinely disturbing piece of American history. A scientific program that has spent nearly 60 years tracking, disc by disc, exactly how clear a lake remains is a genuinely remarkable achievement in environmental monitoring. Neither of those needs a conspiracy of corrupt officials or a field of leaking barrels bolted on to make it compelling. The real story is compelling enough on its own, and it has the added advantage of being something you can actually go verify for yourself, in published research reports, in news archives, and in the ongoing work of the scientists who are still out on that lake today, lowering a small white disk into the water and watching carefully to see exactly how far down it disappears.